Hi there, my name is Robert Sherwood, and this is my Criminal Justice Capstone Final Project Report. Crime in Society. Crime will always be part of society, although it may evolve and methods of handling it may change. The rate of crime is growing. From the challenge of crime in a free society, crime increased 50% between 1959 to 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson instituted a commission to investigate crime in the 1960s and provide recommendations. President Johnson attributed crime to impoverished areas not have full respect for the law and deep moral decay in society. He proposed jobs, education, and hope to the impoverished community. He also proposed increased attention to an analysis of crime on the federal, state, and local areas. Focus on specific areas: drugs and drug trafficking, and guns and firearms, juvenile delinquency, and organized crime. Implementation by reorganization of law enforcement processes, evaluation of training opportunities for law enforcement, methods to improve the public's opinion of law enforcement and public responsibility to adhere to laws, efficiency of certain corrective and rehabilitative programs, and identity areas of federal support of local law enforcement, encompassing focus of maintaining citizens' rights. The public's attitude toward crime and law enforcement. Crime in the 1960s caused public anxiety and fear. Public was polled as to why they thought crime was on the rise. Results: juvenile delinquency caused by the lack of parental guidance and decreasing moral structure were top reasons. The public looked to the police as the end-all solution for the management and prevention of crime. Juvenile delinquency and youth crime. Juveniles comprise the majority of the arrests for crimes against property and significantly contributed to the amount of crimes against persons. Rate of recidivism was highest among youth at that time as well. Between 1960 and 1965, juvenile arrests had increased 55% for rape, robbery, aggravated assault, motor vehicle theft, larceny, burglary, and willful homicide. Arrests for persons over 18 years of age during that time frame only rose by 20%. Lack of parental guidance, structure, and discipline was a huge factor. Gangs of youth were developing as well. Youth were described as having their own culture set apart from the adults, defying authority and materialistic. One of the most significant links to juvenile delinquency were the inner city, low socioeconomic class. The police. In 1965, police forces across the nation were comprised of about 420,000 members across 40,000 agencies nationwide. One-third of the police force were employed by only 55 of said agencies, who served the largest cities. Police were caught in a delicate balance between increased criminal activity and increased social unrest. Police were looked to as a frontline defense against crime and the responsibility to maintain the public safety. There was also a lot of distrust and disrespect towards the police from minority groups at that time, which were those who the police had the most dealings with. Much of the distrust stemmed from a cultural disconnect between the police and those they served, resulting in much misunderstanding. Community relation programs in these situations were a large focus at that time. The courts. Courts were overwhelmed with many cases of public nuisance, such as the publicity drunk, disorderly conduct, and other annoying behavior. Often weeks or months delay to hear the cases. Were often put on the books as criminal behavior and treated as such from a legal standpoint. Also contributed to the public's lack of respect for laws and law enforcement. Need for the continuity and consistency, as well as appropriate classification of crimes versus nuisance cases. Commission advice. Revised bail process for hearing wait outside jail, except for flight risk. Improved structure for a prosecution process. Increase in juror compensation, and increase in facilities and capacity. The correctional system contained approximately 1.3 million. System and taxpayers were becoming overwhelmed and the rate of recidivism was increasing. Corrective method of containment and isolation from society was not doing the inmates any favors, neither was it helping them to reintegrate back into society on their release. Commission recommendations. Probation be used as much as possible for lesser crimes a person may remain functioning member of their society. Maximize inmate rehabilitative programs such as educational programs, vocational training, religious and psychotherapy. Organized crime. Hierarchy society comprised of criminals for the purpose of monetary gain and control, often uses legitimate business as a cover for illegal activity. Growing problem, but many agencies at the time not even aware organized crime existed or how to address it. Commission enlisted the assistance of sociologists, system analysts, political scientists, economics, and a lawyer to investigate. Found that of 71 cities, they found that 20 to 50% of them in various population ranges contained organized crime. Criminals had infiltrated many levels of the government, either directly or by bribery. Government had to change identity of those who tested against it for their protection. Narcotics and drug abuse, increasing drug use, trafficking, new types of drugs. Other criminal activity that surrounds the use and trafficking of narcotics, which results in areas of higher crime and decreased safety for the public. Arrest, incarcerate with or without treatment. Release and then rearrest again. Realize that while the addiction was an issue, there were also usually mental disorders that went along with it. Data showed that cracking down hard with drug crimes in terms of sentencing was not correlating with decreased drug crimes. Commission recommendation. A situational approach be taken in the sentencing of drug crimes. This would include evaluating the nature and severity of the crime, past offenses, and the intended use of the possession. Combined with rehabilitative approach with treatment programs, the goal was reintegration into society without the use of drugs, as opposed to a road of recidivism most often seen with drug-related offenses. Drunkenness offenses. For the year of 1965, there were 2 million arrests in America for drunkennesses, which was one-third of the arrests for that year. Drunkenness disorderly in a public place, although in some places, drunkenness is the crime itself. Majority of those arrests were of the same people over and over again. Holding cells called tanks, where often many drunks could be held in all at once. Post bail or appear in court the next day, where they would often be seen in groups. Commission recommendations. Loosening the conditions or drunkenness as a crime worthy of arrest to only cases of specified disorderliness or threat of harm to others. Use of detox centers could be used as inpatient treatment centers. Use halfway houses, public housing, and other resources. Resources be devoted towards studying alcoholism in order to develop more treatment opinions. Control of firearms. Trending increase of gun crimes and fatalities, but people wanted personal guns for protection. The National Firearms Act of 1934, which applied to machine guns, short-barreled guns, silencers, and sawed-off rifles and shotguns, required that they all be registered with the Treasury Department. Federal Firearms Act of 1938 regulated the manufacturers and gun dealers, requiring serial numbers on most guns, preventing the purposeful selling of guns to felons or those who were active fugitives. Mutual Security Act of 1954 allowed the President to impose regulations on the importing and exporting of the firearms. Various additional regulations to state levels. Problematic source seemed to be mail order guns. Commission recommendations. Strengthen federal law regarding the interstate shipping of firearms. Enactment of state laws requiring the registration of all handguns, rifles, and shotguns. Prohibit the sale of ownership of firearms by certain types of people, dangerous criminals, habitual drunkards, and drug addicts. Congress, a federal registration law applying to those states that have not passed their own registration laws after 5 years. Science and technology. Justice Department overlooked for grant for research and development. Only saw trickle-down effect for mostly crime labs and radio networks. Most scientists and engineers were involved with military solutions. Commission recommendations. Allocation of funds for research and development, prioritization for what would be projected to be the most beneficial and cost-effective towards the fighting and prevention of crime. Recruit universities to develop a research team comprised of scientists, lawyers, biologists, economists, sociologists, psychologists, physics, computer scientists, electrical engineers, and mathematicians. Develop action plan and method for the improvement based off the research they compile. A national strategy. Areas where crime prevails, impoverished, low socioeconomic status, commission recommendations. To combat the problem of crime, address these underlying factors, reduce prejudice, social injustices, and discrimination, while promoting social outreach and community building. Other initiatives use of counseling and therapy, rehabilitative efforts, parole, and community groups. Collaboration and communication between local, state, and federal teams. Monetary support, federal aid, and state supplementation. Development of new programs to meet needs, law reform, organization of procedures of agencies, and justice. Federal prevention programs, additional education, and training for police officers, and advancement in information systems. Omnibus Crime Controls and Safety Streets Act of 1968 grants to develop planning agencies which would devise action plans to develop improvement strategies for law enforcement both state and local levels. Regulated handguns, shipping restrictions, buyer statement of gun for lawful use, buyer information/identification with sale of firearm. Limitations and regulations on wiretaps. Must obtain order from judge or could not be used as evidence. Violations of fine or imprisonment. FBI training programs for state and local law enforcement at their request. Enhanced restrictions on admissions in court. Must be voluntary. Have had access to legal counsel. Regulated time on detainment and examined by a judge. Grants for educational opportunities and training for officers. Temporarily salaries of newly established programs. Research and development of new programs. Construction of new correctional or facilities, equipment, and new technology. Contingent on appropriately submitted action plan for application to receive grant. Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. Broad spectrum, all-inclusive approach to prosecuting organized crime. Contains supposed discrepancies, gray areas, open to interpretation in its application. A narrow, conservative approach when using the legislative history as a primary decision-making tool. A liberal approach using the words of the statutory language as a rationale. Crime charges, section 93B, is usually utilized. Civil cases often implement section 1964A. Very few actual cases to establish baseline judgments on how they should be handled. Inconsistencies and contradictions, therefore, were also handled at the individual discretion of the courts. Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 1974. The institutionalization of statutes offenders, keeping juveniles who have committed a statutes offense out of an institution. Community programs for medical treatment, counseling/therapy, alcoholism treatment, educational, vocational training, and other rehabilitative services. Sight and sound separation of juvenile and adult offenders, keeping juveniles out of the same facilities and areas as adult offenders. Juveniles in adult facilities were 8 times more likely to commit suicide, twice as likely to be assaulted by staff, and had a 50% higher chance of being attacked with a weapon over juveniles in separate institutions. Expectations for juveniles with criminal felony convictions or accusations. Disproportionate minority incarceration of juveniles. Rate of arrest were disproportionate to the population of juveniles. Community outreach programs providing employment opportunities for family support, counseling, therapy, and family planning services. Family activities, child care assistance, provide community centers for youth involvement and activities. Provide training for the youth as sub-professionals, recruit religious groups and other social engagement, and establish youth service bureaus to coordinate programs. Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. Standardized sentencing range guidelines for different classifications of crimes. Reduce massive discrepancies in sentences for similar crimes, including being influenced by location and racial or socioeconomic status. Creation of the United States Sentencing Commission, responsible for notating and implementing these standardized sentences. Sentences can be modified on rational of extenuating circumstances. Fine schedules for different crimes, while also taking into account the defendant's financial situation with respect to the amount of the fine that will be required. Penalties for crime of credit card and banking fraud. Federal penalties for the cultivation, possession, and transfer of marijuana. Lower the age of a juvenile to be tried as an adult in cases of felony charges from age 16 to age 15. Enable civil for future. Crime Control Act of 1990. distribution of grants for duplication of successful programs that investigate and prosecute child abuse, increased penalties with range of prison sentence for sexual abuse crimes, especially involving minors or previous charges of abuse. Victim rights were established, treated fairly, appointed a court liaison, notified of hearings, sentencing, and release. Notification of resources for medical treatment, counseling, and therapy. Drug enforcement allocated funds to the Drug Enforcement Agency with directions for use, increased sentencing for certain drug crimes, as well as made mandatory sentencing for certain crimes. Violent Crime Control and Enforcement Act of 1994. Federal assault weapons ban, changed definitions of some weapons, banned the manufacture, possession, or transfer of semi-automatic weapons from the general public, and banned high-capacity magazines and large-capacity ammunition feeding devices. Federal death penalty describes specific situations and inclusionary criteria that must be met to be eligible for the death penalty. Included exclusionary criteria as well. Required a separate hearing to decide on the death penalty. Allowed for the standard process of appeal after final judgment. Violence against women. Grants for personnel, training, equipment, and data collection to train law enforcement in identifying and responding. Developing or expanding units to target crimes against women. Developing improved policies, services, protocols, and strategies. Developing or improving a data tracking system of violent crimes, outstanding warrants, or restraining orders. Violations of orders and prosecutions and convictions for violent crimes against women, and developing or improving victim services such as victims' court advocates. Community-oriented policing, training and programs for community interaction to boost trust and prevent crime. President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, building trust and legitimacy, review data for use of force, training for de-escalation, techniques instead of use of force, utilize police officer standards and training for fair and unbiased policing methods, share data with public for transparency and to increase trust, ensure officers have equipment they need, work with community leaders to develop community programs, police and oversight, brainstorm with the community to determine what is needed, focus on areas of transportationality, high crime, transparency with community on policies, training to uphold policy, emphasize on rights of citizens, data tracking for accountability, technology and social media, direct connection to the public, asset to the department, increase accountability / defense of actions. President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing continued. Community policing and crime reduction, build relationships with familiarity, work collaboratively with school, church, businesses, court system, district attorney's office, evaluate successful areas to carry over into all areas, training, de-escalation techniques, and decreased use of force. Training and education, technology, immigration, racial divides, and mental health crises, use simulations, create hub of information for nationwide access to training methods. Leadership training at all levels, crisis intervention training for mental health situations, and cultural training. Officer wellness and safety, realistic simulation training with research to know which types to use. Task force to study the mental health problems specific to law enforcement officers. Annual psychological and physiological wellness checks. Fewer restrictions on benefits and pension plans, anonymous mental health and counseling hotline, emergency medical kits with associated training, and more bulletproof vests. Future of criminal justice in America. Crime has changed since the 1940s. Shift from organized and juvenile crime to terrorism, now to racial crimes. An anticipated decrease in crime by 2040 due to decreased rate of males aged 15 to 29. Increased technological ability to fight crime, accompanied with global collaboration. Culture of policing. Currently, civil unrest and distrust of police. Justice and Policing Act of 2020, not passed yet into law, addresses concerns of police overstep, abuse of power, and excessive use of force. Question of structure of police force. Talk of adding social workers to the force. Currently, much work to be done in the public's perception of police and to establish trust and respect.